Janeane, and this is Outside the Box. Today I'm in conversation with UC Irvine students from the Wellness Initiative in Social Ecology, also known as WISE. Welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be here. So I'd just like to talk a little bit more about WISE is and the group of students that lead WISE. The Wellness Initiative in Social Ecology, or WISE, is a wellness resource for the UCI community. And we started in the summer 2020 because we saw that students were really struggling during the pandemic, but they felt as though the resources on campus weren't adequate enough for their needs, or they felt like they weren't being heard. So we wanted to start WISE to create peer support for everyone and provide services, or not, future services and currently peer support through resources and education in hopes that students will feel more comfortable in safe spaces and really talk about their own stories without fear of being judged or without internalizing that stigma that we often see in our community. And so WISE is led by the Peer Advisory Collective, or the PAC, and we are student-led, student-driven team that really prides ourselves on being diverse. And we're all super passionate about mental health advocacy. We want to create real change in wellness and mental health in the UCI community, specifically the School of Social Ecology. So as a team, we aim to destigmatize mental health issues and increase access to mental health uses and resources.
That's amazing, Phoebe. Thank you. So how did you all hear about WISE? I mean, Phoebe, you got involved initially, but how about the rest of you? Paul, do you want to go?
So this was the end of my junior year, and I was looking into grad school, and this didn't really have to do with grad school, but it was more so making an impact on in UCI before I graduated. And so I was just scrolling through Facebook and I see a flyer saying, "Oh, join the WISE Pack." And I was like, sounds interesting. But the funny thing is it passed the deadline. And I asked Sod, the original, or the president of WISE, and he was like, "Yeah, sure, you can apply." And so here I am now.
A few years later, right?
Yeah. Or a few months later.
Oh, 2 months later. Okay.
Yeah.
What about you, Dong-An?
Yeah, for me, it very much aligns with Paul's experience as well, but I actually heard about it through Phoebe, or I call her Fee. So she was like, "You should totally join, you should totally apply." And I was like, this is something that I am really interested in. And I was a transfer student, so this was going to be my last year, and I wanted to make the most out of that year and get more involved, as well as involving myself with mental health advocacy. So this was the perfect fit for me. So
Great.
I just applied to make the most out of my last year.
What about you, Serena?
I would say mine's similar to Dong-An's, but I learned about WISE from one of my classes. They would have you can do extra credit by going to the WISE events. And so I went to one of the events and I was like, wow, I really liked how everybody was so passionate about mental health. And I wanted to get into advocacy. And so I reached out to Fee too as well to see if there was any positions open. But I would go to WISE Wednesdays and I learned a lot. And I really enjoyed the atmosphere and everything.
It's great. And you, David?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah.
Hi. So
by the way, you look like a fighter pilot or something.
Yeah, this is my
Doesn't
chair.
he?
Yeah.
He's got this guy.
Yeah. Well, for me, I think that I first heard of WISE because I was having an academic advising meeting with one of the the advisors at the School of Social Ecology, and I wanted to find some way to kind of go beyond my majors, because I'm poli-sci and criminology, but mental health just seems like something completely extricated from those topics. But I was like, I might as well try it because it sounds fun. And the advisor said, "Oh, I've spoken for WISE Pack before, you should check it out." And then I was like, okay. So I went to check it out and I signed up and met the leaders like Phoebe and Yuran. She's not here.
She was on my show.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember. Yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah, that was it. It's been a pretty
That's
good
great.
experience. Yeah.
Do you feel like this experience at UCI with WISE has helped you feel maybe less isolated and more connected?
Yeah, definitely. Because especially, right now, like with the pandemic, it's really hard to establish connections with other people. And now that even though things are kind of getting back to normal, I mean, I guess normal, it's always nice to have like this sense of belonging to an organization, especially if you share those same passions with others towards the same goal. Yeah.
Have any of you experienced some of the things I've read about where students are depressed and anxious and feeling all kinds of feelings at this time? I mean, we are in a mental health pandemic. You're nodding your heads. Does anybody want to share? You don't have to share personal, whatever you want to share.
I honestly I'd say before the pandemic, I was a pretty extroverted person and I had no problem hanging around people. But I think since the pandemic, I've become more introverted, more like socially anxious and more depressed just because I'm so used to being isolated and not being around very many people except family members. And I'd say my family environment also isn't the best. So being at home wasn't the best for my mental health. And I always looked forward to going back to school because I thought it would be better. I'd be like surrounded by more positive energy. But also I found myself even more exhausted being surrounded by people now. I just have, I guess, what we call like not very much of a social battery. It drains very easily.
Sure.
So I think because of that, it's also improved my mental health in a way because I used to be very dependent on socialization. I thought that my happiness was dependent on being around other people and having a lot of friends. But through the pandemic, it was hard at first, but now I'm become more comfortable with being by myself, with being like lonely sometimes. And I think that now I'm able to do things more independently. And I think that for a lot of people, their mental health has deteriorated. But for me, I think a plus is that I've grown a little bit in that way.
That's great. So you might be alone, but you might not be lonely. But it sounds like you've kind of peeled away the layers and gotten to know yourself. Yeah, that's good. Anybody else?
I feel like, yeah, same with Fee, like it kind of being like isolated made you kind of almost like sit with yourself and have to like for me, I had to learn how to like self-soothe myself because I come from a family who we don't really talk about emotions. It's really like stigmatized, the whole like machismo culture. And so I had to learn to like take care of myself and like figure out what is it that I need. And really try and get in touch with my emotions because I grew up learning that like your emotions are you just constantly repress them. And so having to be isolated and feeling like depressed and feeling anxious, I was like, okay, I'm feeling bad right now. Like I need to figure out how to take care of myself. And so I learned that, going to therapy is what helped me and helped me learn the tools that I needed.
Yep.
And so in a way, it was like a self-discovery experience.
You know something? I'll tell you, about a year ago, I started going to therapy because I have daughters and they were struggling. It was making me depressed. It was bringing back stuff when I was growing up. And I always thought, oh, I'm fine. Oh, I can handle it. And, you realize, hey, I can handle it and it's okay. Yeah, it was one of the best decisions. Anybody else? Like, what are been your coping mechanisms during this time?
I think for my personal experience, it definitely aligns with both Serena's and Fee in the sense that pre-pandemic, my mental health was pretty already bad. Like I was already depressed and an anxious person. But I really love socializing. I really love overworking myself. I'm a person that likes to be in environments that are very productive because that's what I attach my self-worth to. So if I'm not productive, I just feel like lethargic and it makes me overthink about myself. So when we had the pandemic happen and there was no in-person school, no in-person work, it was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And it was really, really rough for me. I think my mental health during the peak of the pandemic was just hitting a low. And like Fee and Serena, I had to stay with my family. And it's an environment where it didn't make me feel good, and there was no one I could talk to. So it was really rough. But through that roughness, I was able to discover, okay, it's okay to be alone, and actually sitting with myself and sitting with my thoughts and reevaluating it, as well as learning new methods of how to cope in a healthier way. Because I really think that the pandemic helped me realize that my current coping mechanisms were very unhealthy. So instead of overworking myself, I try to do new hobbies like journaling and embroidering and just reaching out for different ways, and also starting therapy this year, which is really helpful for me. So I also discovered, yes, this is a great resource for me through the pandemic.
Definitely. Anybody else? I have a question. How do you think we got to a mental health pandemic? Because a couple of you talked about we were in a mental health crisis. Was it just the pandemic, or do you think there were things leading up to it? Do you think also, like society, we would never say, oh, I'm going to a therapist, or, oh, I need a mental health day. Do you think the pandemic just kind of exacerbated what was already happening?
I think, well, now as like, we're going through the pandemic and we're learning more about mental health. I just think that like elementary schools and preschools, like it's just not like a required thing to teach about mental health and to teach children like these emotion regulation skills at a really young age. And so, there could be like a generational thing where like their family shows them that, oh, your emotions, like don't cry, don't, like, you need to be strong. Yeah. And so I think that it just passes down, and eventually now it's gotten to a point where it's a lot and people can see that it's like affecting everyone. Yeah.
Where have you heard that schools are teaching this to young kids?
Well, I actually just joined a program, and we're going to be implementing like positive-based interventions to children and teaching them these emotion regulation skills and like mindfulness. So little by little, it's getting implemented into classrooms. And I think that that's a really big thing.
That's great. Are you studying to become a teacher?
I'm thinking of being a school psychologist.
That's great. That's amazing. Have some of you changed your path as far as degrees or choice of career based on the pandemic? You're all sticking to the same like goals as far as jobs after college, or?
I think the pandemic kind of really pushed me and like confirmed that I really want to be a mental health advocate, and I really want to be someone who helps the community through clinical work. So I want to be a therapist and help people. And I've seen that like my peers are really struggling, and they feel like no one is there for them, or they feel like their therapists aren't the right fit for them because they don't have like the cultural competency tools, or because they're not our age group going through the pandemic, they can't necessarily take our perspectives. Yeah. So I think that with my identity and recognition that we have all of these issues going on right now, I just really want to go into that career path.
That's great. That's really great. Do you think that schools need to do things differently in the pandemic as far as how they're handling the mental health of students?
Definitely. I feel like it could just be talked about more. I mean, I know we have like the WISE Pack and we have like these resources on school, but I still feel like there's that stigmatization, or more of just like it's uncomfortable for people to talk about depression and anxiety and other mental health problems. And so I think maybe like if like teachers talk about it more, like just it being more in conversation, because I still feel like, it's a little uncomfortable to talk about mental health, but it shouldn't be. Like it should just be like any other, like any other health. Just like working out, too. Like it should just be like a normal thing that people talk about.
And I will say this, I was talking to a few people, and somebody said, not a student, I feel like more teachers and more adults should share their stories with students, share their struggles. So you feel like, oh, okay, I think they probably get it or can understand to some degree. Obviously, we don't know what it's like to be your age and grow up in the pandemic and miss different milestones and things. But if we have a common story, that probably makes you more comfortable, I would think. There's been a lot of research that shows that teachers have quit. I mean, they didn't have any notice, and the amount of pressure and anxiety that they have faced. And I find it interesting that STEM and STEAM were adopted, but mental health is not part of the curriculum in a lot of schools. Does anybody have thoughts on that?
I would say that, so like from one of my experiences, like maybe like a few months ago, I revisited my high school because I wanted to meet one of my favorite teachers, my English teacher for junior year, and I talked to him about it, and he told me that at least in the high school, like a lot of students actually they dropped out. Like when the pandemic happened, they just could not bear it. I don't know what their individual circumstances were, but
Wow.
I genuinely believe that a lot of those kids, even though the school was making accommodations saying like, oh, you'll go half the classes per day, so we'll lighten the workload, but even then these students they fail all their classes and they just are kicked out.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, if we had those mental health resources, it would definitely be more beneficial, because I remember back, at least in high school, like you don't hear it, you don't ever get exposed to that. You might be taught all these other different subjects like history or math or biology, but you'll never be exposed to that. And they'll have counselors on standby, but no one seems to ever go to them.
Yeah, that's interesting. So they can have the counselors and the resources, but the students, they don't feel comfortable going.
Yeah, I do not think that students are in today's society, or even at least at the high school level, open to taking advantage of those resources.
Because they don't want to open themselves up to criticism from their peers, maybe?
Possibly. I mean, I feel like, yeah, I think that we might say that at least in today's society, at least with technology and everything, that you can always blame it on, that it's easier for students individually to retreat into virtual platforms or internet chat rooms, instead of talking about their problems in person. But I think that even with this new advanced technological milieu that you have, kids today are still similar to kids, I'd say maybe like 50 years ago, in that they don't want to be open with these things, at least in front of their friends, if they want to, I don't know, maybe look cooler, or, say that they're not as emotionally damaged or weakened. Yeah.
Well, when I think about all the factors that have affected students, from their parents losing jobs, because, over 42 million people lost jobs at the beginning of the pandemic. And there's so much stress for a lot of parents as well as students living at home. There's a lot of data that comes out about, depression, anxiety, suicide, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many factors that have contributed. Yeah.
I just wanted to go back a little bit to the teachers quitting. So during the spring, when we first started the pandemic, I had a writing professor. And I remember the class was pretty difficult because it was an upper division writing course. And since we were all transitioning to being online and getting used to that, I think a lot of students were kind of complaining about the workload and that the professor wasn't being accommodating enough. But I decided to reach out and ask for office hours, and I attended. And then after a few sessions, she opened up and told me that she herself was struggling from depression, so she couldn't be on top of like deadlines and always be responsive to the students. And I felt like that was really heartbreaking, because the students were like very actively criticizing her, but no one like really reached out for help. And she was like, no students are coming to my office hours, so I feel alone. And I was like, that's really sad. And so I think sometimes we forget that teachers are human too, and they also are struggling, and all of our struggles are valid. So sometimes we should be a little bit more patient and a little more understanding.
Definitely. That's a really important story to share. Thank you. I mean, I even hear stories, nurses have left the profession, doctors have left the profession. A lot of people have just, resigned or retired. What would you suggest if you could change things, how we can become better humans. Like what would help all of you? Because I've heard things that people have said, well, we need people to be kinder or more compassionate and be better listeners. And I don't know if all of you are, feel very connected to your parents, or if there's someone that you turn to, but do you feel heard? Do you feel like you can open up and share with an adult? And if nobody wants to answer, we can skip that question.
I'll just answer. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
This one. Okay. I'll make it quick then. So, at least for me, like when I talk to my parents about like mental health, because I remember, like, I will be honest that during the during the spring quarter of sophomore year, towards the end, I think that was the closest I ever got to like a mental breakdown, just completely just losing function.
Mhm.
And the reason why was not anything that to me seemed that serious at the time, but now that I think about it, I think it was like, it's like just this feeling of like all your academic responsibilities on top of your familial responsibilities and your work responsibilities all just kind of bear on you all at once. And that when that happened at that time, and I would talk to my parents about it, they'll listen, but listening is not the same as being heard, right? My parents would listen to me. I would say like I'm like seriously considering not going to school anymore. Like I cannot bear it any longer. And my parents would just say, "Oh, well, you can just try a bit harder, and I think you can do it." And that seems very vague, but I think that at the time I was really like, what does that even like? What does that mean?
Yeah.
Like, how can I try even harder now when I feel like I cannot even function any longer?
Yeah.
But I think like that's why, like, if I didn't have some of my close friends to talk to, I don't think I would have ever gotten out of that.
Is that what helped you through this? Is your friends?
Yes, I mean, like I know I heard from other people before, at least from their personal experiences, that they said that throughout the pandemic that maybe that they were generally more extroverted, or maybe like Phoebe, she mentioned that she went from extroverted to introverted more. But for me, I feel like I've always been like that, like introverted, just always. So like like the pandemic, in a sense, it didn't really change my lifestyle. I'm just at home all the time anyway. But like the few friends that I do have, the close friends, it's like I think that even being able to talk long distance through like social media, I think that was it was imperative, I think.
Yeah. I am so amazed by your generation because you're very passionate about very important issues that I would say older generations, they're not as passionate at times. I mean, not everyone's like that, but you, like, for instance, Greta Thunberg, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ rights, there are very specific things that are so important that have just not been focused on. And now I feel that the pandemic has really shined a light on it. Would you agree with that? And what are you passionate about? Janeane, you want to?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think in regards to some aspects, for example, like mental health and the pandemic, like earlier you were asking about like why has it been more prominent now after the pandemic?
Yeah.
And I think a really good response is people are seeing the physical manifestation of what happens when people aren't getting the help they need.
Mhm.
Because physical well-being is very much tied with your mental well-being. Like a great book to read is by Robert Sapolsky's Why Don't Zebras Get Ulcers? Like stress can evolve into something very chronic.
I'm writing that down.
Yeah. So that's like, I think people will start to realize, wow, this is the physical manifestation of what happens when your mental health and mental well-being is not being supported, what physically manifests. And I think even for people who already were going to therapy, that transition to going to telehealth is really hard for both mental health professionals who have to now like switch onto Zoom and know how to do that. And also for a lot of people who might not even know how to use Zoom or might not have the resources.
Yes.
So I think there's a systemic barrier,
Mhm.
and people are recognizing it because they're being affected themselves, or they know people who are being affected, and it's like indirectly affecting them. And something specific that I've gotten really passionate about is focusing for folks who've been traumatized through domestic violence, sexual violence, family violence, things like that. Because I did my internship with UCI Care, which is the Campus Assault Resources and Education Center.
That's great.
And I realized during the pandemic, so many folks had to be housed with their abusers. And oftentimes this can lead to very traumatic experiences. And seeing how affected they were and seeing firsthand these stories really, really made me more passionate towards that field.
Mhm.
So that's something that I'm very focused on. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Paul, did you want to share something?
I was gonna say something earlier about David's comment about his parents disregarding like what he said. I've actually had a similar experience where like I actually wanted to like not go to school anymore.
Yeah.
And when I told my parents that, it they were just like, just finish it. Like, why are you gonna like leave everything you've done so far? And then yeah, it just like angered me inside and made me realize like I can't really go to them when I'm like sharing my emotions. And so
Mhm.
that's why I myself go to my friends instead.
Yeah. And has WISE helped you in that way too? Because it's a group of people all focused on mental health. I guess that's putting you on the spot. If you say no, you're in trouble.
It's okay. If I say no, then they won't. No, I'm just kidding. But I think WISE has definitely helped. Like it's gotten me to meet a lot of amazing people, and it's allowed me to use my creativity to its fullest.
Amazing. Could you elaborate on that as far as your creativity?
Yeah. So for my cluster, we usually do events or
Mhm.
cluster events, and part of planning, I usually like to have like fun when planning my events. And so I usually like, if I'm like inspired by something, I try to like think of a way to like make it mine. So like for example, I have an event coming up where we place a whiteboard in the middle of like in like social ecology, and you get to either or you get a post-it note and post it on the whiteboard, and then you can like write something nice for the next person to take.
That's
And so
nice.
I got that idea from like a community food thing where you like leave something and then you like put something back, or like you take what you
Yes.
need and then you
Yes.
put something back
Yes.
for someone else to get.
So kind of like you go to a food bank with a can of beans, you donate it, and then you see pasta, and then you take that pasta for yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, I saw you smiling when you talk about creativity. I think creativity really helps boost mental health quite a bit. And also, Dongyan, being thoughtful to other people, doing something for somebody else. I think that's another tool to, staying positive when things feel kind of dark. Are there things that you turn to help lift you up when you're having a tough day? Hobby, or just talking to a friend, or some of you are you musical?
I just listen to music and try to listen to like positive, kind of like upbeat music. If I'm feeling sad, I try and do like the opposite. Because if I'm listening to like some sad music, then it'll just bring me back down.
Yeah.
So I've been trying to listen to like more upbeat music when my days have been feeling a little off, and it's been helping.
That's
So.
great. That's really good. Anybody else want to share what they do when they're having a tough day?
I personally like to go on walks with my dog, and part of that walk, I do this thing called mindfulness and being present at the moment, and like just enjoying the outside and like appreciating like a sunny, cold, breezy day.
Nice.
Yeah.
I saw somebody put up a sign here in Irvine celebrating somebody's 90th birthday. So I turned around and I said to this woman, "Is that your birthday?" She says, "My husband, he's 90." And she was, I guess, in her late 80s. And so I turned back around and I'm like, "Do you want me to take your picture? You're so cute, the two of you." And they were like, "Yes, please." Like that kind of thing made me happy, but it made them happy, you know? Anybody else?
I also do the same as Serena, and I've been trying the opposite, trying to listen to positive music, but I also really like cooking. I think it's a good outlet for me, mostly because it's something that makes me zone out of the issue. So distracting myself from my negative feelings. But if I'm also feeling very frustrated and angry, I can also sort of take that and reframe my mindset like, well, if I'm frustrated and angry, my food won't come out good. I don't know why I think that way. I think my mom raised me with like, if you're frustrated and angry, your food's gonna come out bad because you won't season it right. So it's been something helpful for me.
As I'm listening to all of you and the other people I've spoken to, that you are building these incredible resilience tools, because as you move through life and you face challenges, you most likely will turn to those things that you're using now. So as adults, you are going to go into work, and if you're having a tough day, you're probably going to voice the same thing you did in college. "Hey, I need a mental health day," or this is what I need. And that's a real important learning moment right now. And I've been talking to students, and I'll say, if you're not doing well in school, just know it does not predict your future. Okay. And I say this because at one point I was a DF student in high school. I had a tough home life. I have a PhD now. And I was probably the least likely in my class to get a PhD. And I didn't think I wanted a PhD, but I took a couple classes because I had lost my job. The whole industry took a dive. It wasn't me. They were closing our office, and I felt lost. So having like a love of learning, being curious, being thoughtful to yourself. I mean, some of these things you've been talking about. Is there anything else you want to add as far as a society, what we can do better to be better humans, to improve mental health, like changes you'd like to see? You talked about it in schools, but are there things you'd like to see done differently?
I think this is going to be a very hard one, but this
Okay.
is something I am very passionate about. And I know Fee is too, is about intergenerational trauma. And I think that oftentimes we leave out our parents or the older folks, the older generations, and the consideration for their mental health. I know that it's very rough for me and my parents' relationship because they never understood what mental health is. And when I say I had mental health issues, they sort of like mocked it and dismissed it. And I never felt safe to open that up again.
Mm-hmm.
But I realized now as an adult that because they were refugees from a war, they had a lot of unresolved trauma on their own, and they were in survival mode, and they just didn't have that time to process it. So sometimes it really takes showing compassion to them, and also showing compassion to our older generation, like understanding that they might not understand what mental health is, and that's okay. But we could try to be a little bit more compassionate and take that approach in as a way to maybe bridge the gap, hopefully.
Yes.
Since something new that I've learned about trauma too is that I used to think of trauma as a very more of like a negative connotative way, but then a great thing that I've learned is that trauma is just your natural body's response. It's your body protecting you from whatever the experience is, but it isn't a part of you. It's just something that happened to you. And I think thinking of it that way really helped me understand my parents, that trauma, while they went through some traumatic events, it doesn't make up who they are.
Yes.
And that these experiences affected them, but I should also be compassionate to them, just like I am to the community that I serve and to myself when I talk about how trauma have affected me. Like It's just the body's normal way of saying, this is your anxiety acting out is a way to protect yourself, you know? Yeah. And starting to think of mental health in a more normalized and destigmatized way, rather than so heavily negative, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
I think too, like going off of what Diane is saying, is that like learning more about mental health and like being in the field is kind of, helping us become more self-aware and like look at these intergenerational like patterns. And so I've been actually now I've been able to see my parents, also in that way where it's like they had traumatic childhoods, and I can understand why, growing up, they weren't able to be there for me because their parents weren't there for them. And then I can imagine that it just keeps going down. And so learning like different skills and stuff, I've been like helping my mom and like trying to like teach my parents more about mental health and really try and break that cycle. Because I look at them as children too now, like I see them as a hurt child, and I just want to hold them and give them what they needed. And so I think that's really important to look at.
That is beautiful. I mean, because you think about, they have their scars, their wounds, and no one has really said to them, let's talk about it, or what happened, and so you're creating this ability for them to open up, and it'll really long-term bring you so much closer for that. That's really great. Anybody else?
Yeah, I kind of just want to expand upon what Diane and Serena mentioned. So I am very interested in how like immigrants feel after their traumatic experiences, especially when it comes to that generational trauma that can be passed down. And I feel like an important thing that we all have to do is just be more accepting. And to be more accepting, we just have to listen to people's lived experiences and also kind of denormalize certain things within our community. For example, I feel like, at least in Asian cultures, emotional and physical abuse can be kind of normalized because they're like, oh, this is just a way to parent you, or this is how our parents parented us. So this is how we're going to do it because it's effective. And they don't realize that it impacts their children like a lot. And I think with that, when the trauma is passed down, it can also lead to comparison of struggles. Like, because my parents were immigrants, they're like, oh, like your struggles can't be as valid as mine because I traveled across the country to immigrate from my country that was in war. So I think kind of just getting them to realize that their experiences aren't the only ones that are valid. They should also be listening to others who are struggling and going through the same thing. And I feel like through that education, we can kind of start to reduce the stigma within our community. Like, my parents very much think that mental health issues are not a problem or that they aren't real. And I think, like, as we mentioned, it's because they haven't resolved their own traumas and they haven't talked about their own issues. So kind of pushing them to seek support and seek help while doing so for ourselves is super important for everyone to be more accepting.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. It's so interesting. I think back when my dad was alive and he was very angry at times. And I finally, as I got older, I thought, let's try to unpack why he's angry. And through the anger, it was really fear. And through the fear, it was hurt and it was trauma. But at first I was upset and I was emotional. And then as I got older, I was just very chill about it. And I was like, this is not me. This is not directed at me. This is his backstory talking. Yeah. So is there anything else you want to share or advice for someone who's watching this or listening and they are struggling with their mental health?
I just want to point out one of my favorite psychologists, who's Brene Brown. My therapist showed me her, and I watch her TED Talks, and it just makes me smile. And she also has a Netflix series right now. And her whole thing is, don't be afraid to be vulnerable, and in the sense of like, being able to go through that uncomfortable feeling, and like being able to be yourself, and not worrying too much about other things that are going on in your life. Like, I know in her book, she talks about like scarcity, which is like this belief that everyone thinks we don't have enough time. And so then, especially like being in like the field where you're working a lot, like you never give yourself enough time, or like you think, oh, I don't have enough time. I have all this work to do. Yeah. But I think she really focuses on like, just being able to like push that to the side and like focus on yourself and figure out what it is that you need. and she focuses a lot on empathy, and she's just an overall amazing psychologist. And
She's
I think,
great.
she has a lot of words of wisdom.
I'm glad you shared that for other people, to look her up. She's great. I have read some of her books. Anybody else?
I feel like this is maybe a cheesy line that everybody says, but when people say healing is nonlinear, it really is. And I think it's something I have to remind myself, because sometimes I'm doing really good. 2 months, I'm doing super good about my mental health.
Yeah.
And then I just reach a day where it all falls apart. And it doesn't make sense to me why it's falling apart.
Mhm.
So I think an important reminder is just to remind yourself that mental health and just healing in general is nonlinear, and that's one. And two, to try and figure out your triggers, whether that be through therapy, whether that be through just doing activities that is helping you improve your mental health. And it could be in like creative outlets, exercising, yoga, so many ways. But just figuring out your triggers is really important. And that's something I've been working with. And putting boundaries with yourself is a big reminder, because I always think, oh, boundaries are other people, but you also have to put boundaries with yourself. And that's also really important when it comes to your mental health, and not pushing yourself too far, and also reminding yourself that you have boundaries and you can't cross those.
Damn, thank you.
I think my advice to both myself and other people would be know your emotional capacity. And so this is a theme that we've been talking about a lot in Wise, but because workaholism is sort of the culture of our generation, I feel like we always have to be productive. We always have to be doing something. And like Danya mentioned, my self-worth is kind of based on academics or doing well, being successful. And of course, that's super detrimental to mental health when you're not doing well or you face rejection. And I think knowing where your emotional capacity is. So if you can't get something done for that day, just like move on. You can do it another day. Or if you need a break, kind of ask for help, see if you need any support. So setting those boundaries with yourself, kind of getting to know yourself and being comfortable with yourself, and not pushing yourself too hard, because you'll always have yourself. You won't always have other people. So even though they may have certain expectations of you, you should always put yourself first.
That's great. David or Paul, do you want to add anything? No pressure.
Yeah, I can add on. What Phoebe said, I thought of this one quote where it was like, life is a marathon and not a race. Because if you like keep running as fast as you can, then you'll eventually just collapse.
Yeah.
So like you'll just remember to stop and take a break, like drink water and whatnot.
Yeah. Definitely. I want to ask a question. Unless David, you want to add anything, or you're good? No? Okay.
I'll just say something. So I think like it's actually pretty relevant to what the education cluster is going to be publishing soon. It's going to be a blog post on the nature of a crisis. So what is a crisis? And what I learned, at least from my research on it, is that a crisis is the failure to use old coping mechanisms to return the individual from the crisis state to the pre-crisis state. So kind of returning back to like a status quo. And when our coping mechanisms that we usually have relied on suddenly are no longer effective, then that's when we feel lost and very confused and not sure what to do. I think that from that perspective of what a crisis is, then it is necessary to kind of seek out new coping mechanisms, new ways to address this terrible experience, such as loss of a family member, or maybe even just like a developmental experience, such as like marriage, or maybe just like developmental experiences. But in both of those cases, it's necessary to find new coping mechanisms. So it's I guess the point in the end is that it's all right to seek out help from other people, because peer support and even getting help from a counselor or a mental health professional, that has been proven to address stress, anxiety, and maybe kind of guide you towards the right way to address your crises.
That's great. Thank you. I wanted to ask one thing. I should have asked it a while ago, but technology. You have the world at your fingertips. You can get any information, as graphic as it is. There's no censors at times. Does all this technology stress you out, or do you see the good and the bad, and do you know how to take care of yourself in a healthy technology way? You know what I mean? Taking tech breaks. Anybody?
Yeah. So I'd say probably a mix of the good and bad. The good being that it's easy access to information. If we want to disseminate resources, it's right there for us. But at the same time, social media has become pretty toxic. And I feel like there's this expectation to always be active, to be engaging with others. But sometimes you just don't have the capacity to. And of course, it sometimes can affect mental health in that it it gives rise to like self-esteem issues or body image issues. And sometimes we romanticize that issues, not necessarily we, but as a society, sometimes we hold ourselves to this standard and we want to meet it, but we can't. And then trying to chase after that constantly just like drains us. So while I think it is positive in that it allows us to connect with others, too much time on the internet and too much time using technology can be just as detrimental to mental health.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else want to share?
I think I agree with Fee. A big aspect when you mentioned that, I thought about how peak pandemic, everything went remote. So I was on Zoom for every single classes, every single meeting, and just getting Zoom burnt out. And something that I noticed a lot too is because of the new rise of Zooms in general, events engagement for any organizations or any activities is really low for in-person, and also really low for remote, because people have just felt so tired. They're so burnt out that they don't want to hop on another Zoom for an event or walk and physically go somewhere on campus for an event in person. So I think that that was something really big that was almost like an effect. And like Fee mentioned, some of the things that I've noticed we romanticize on social media when it comes to mental health is very dangerous. And I think that that's something to kind of watch out for when you're on, like if you're using social media platforms for a long time, is seeing these things about mental health and mental illnesses that should not be romanticized. And I think another thing too, I know Dr. Schuler at UCI researches like digital mental health apps and things like that. So just finding a better way to maybe download apps like Headspace or things that help you with your mental health is a really great way of using your apps. Like I know personally what I've been doing is on Instagram, I put like a 15 minutes.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. And then they'll let me know. They're like, you spent your 15 minutes. And I have to put that boundary on myself, like, okay, I gotta hop off. I can't keep scrolling.
It's good.
So just setting boundaries on yourself if you're using it and you notice that it is hurting your self-esteem or mental health issue or mental health.
Great advice. Anybody else? Do you take tech breaks? Do you find yourself getting, spending hours of time on Instagram, TikTok, or no?
Yeah, I actually agree with Donghan and Phoebe, but I'm gonna shed some light for technology because I'm actually in Dr. Schuler's lab, and it's amazing because we usually there's like constant or there's like always new apps on mental health and like trying on like ways to intervene, and so I think that technology is slowly starting to get better in terms of like mental health. Yeah.
As far as the apps go?
Yeah.
Okay. That's good. Great. Anything else you want to add before we wrap? Like, how do you, I know some of you are in midterms. Did you all finish midterms? Did you find yourself really stressed? And if you were, did you turn to something special you want to share as far as coping? No?
I wouldn't say something special per se, but I think I exemplified setting boundaries with myself because I realized that my stress was peaking as it came closer to the day of my midterm. Instead of like studying well into the night and not getting good enough sleep, I kind of just like cut it off. And I was like, even though I don't feel that well prepared, I'd rather prioritize my sleep and feel a little well rested in the morning. And
That's
hopefully
good.
that would like better equip me for taking the midterm.
Yes, as opposed to oversleeping because you got 3 hours sleep and you're trying to take a nap. Yeah. All right, then. This is a wrap. Thank you so much, all of you. This was fantastic, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having us.